of the Beholder by Ruth Nordin, Chapter 1. The story starts in Maine in April 1874. A newspaper ad reads, "Wife wanted. Nebraska farmer looking for a hard-working and dependable woman to marry. Ability to have children a must." Mary Peters reread the ad in the newspaper. Ads asking for a wife were fairly common, but this particular ad caught her eye for a variety of reasons. One, the man who wrote it seemed straightforward, a quality she admired because she didn't trust people who used flowery language, which could be deceptive. Two, the man was realistic about his expectations. A farmer would benefit most from a woman who could handle the harsher elements of living on a farm. Three, the part boldly stating he expected her to bear him children told her that this was a man who did not mince words. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he sought it. Such a man might not be overly concerned with how a woman looked. She glanced at her reflection in the store window. She often passed the dress shop on her way to the restaurant, where she helped Mrs. Jones cook meals for her hungry patrons. Her plain face, with an unusually big nose that made her eyes and thin lips look smaller than they actually were, did not draw interest from men. Her pale, smooth skin would have been her best feature had it not been for the freckles that dotted her cheeks and her nose. Her frizzy, mousy, brown long hair that she had unsuccessfully tried to tame with her brush was mercifully forced under a bonnet. Plain Mary Peters. She heard the term often enough by her family and friends. Certain that they meant no harm in the adjective used to describe her, she did not take offense to it. Besides, she was plain. Considering that they could call her ugly, plain was actually a kind word. Biting her lower lip, she turned her attention back to the ad. Unlike other men requesting women who were pretty, this one simply required hard work, dependability, and willingness to bear him children. She wasn't afraid of those things. Pretty she could not give him, but the others she easily could. Though she had never spent a single day on a farm, she was willing to learn what she needed to do to help him. Her mother had borne her father 12 children, so she was sure that she wouldn't have any problems getting in the family way. She would send him a letter, and if he wished to marry her, she would go to him. Fear of the unknown did not hold her back. She welcomed the adventure of leaving her old world behind for a new one. A fresh start might even be a welcome relief after living in her sister's shadow all of her years. Her sisters were beautiful. They found husbands well before they turned 18. She recalled the wedding of her closest sister, who was only 2 years her senior. Grace had just turned 16, and she was thrilled to marry her childhood sweetheart. Before the wedding, Mary decorated Grace's silky brown hair with pink rose petals. Her sister wore a long flowing white gown, trimmed with lace, which was a labor of love that Mary spent the past 2 months creating. Mary wanted her favorite sister to look her best during the ceremony, for it was a day Grace had eagerly planned from the moment Calvin proposed. While their older sisters decorated the church, they had a moment to themselves in the small church room to the side of the sanctuary. "You are beautiful," Mary smiled as she glanced at her older sister. "I feel beautiful," Grace confessed as she looked at her reflection in the mirror. "That's what love does to a woman, Mary. When Calvin looks at me, it's as if I can see myself through his eyes. And I know when he sees me, he sees the most beautiful woman he ever laid eyes on." That's because Grace was pleasing to gaze upon. Grace wasn't plain. She didn't have to deal with the snickers from the young men when they thought she was out of hearing range. Men practically worshipped the ground Grace walked on. "Someday you'll know what I'm talking about," Grace told her. She reached out and took Mary's hand just as Mary was ready to put another petal in her hair. "Love is the most wonderful feeling in the world. Your time will come." Mary smiled, gently pulled her hand away, and returned to her work. She knew better than to hope to be beautiful in the eyes of a man. She got sight of the contrast between her and her sister, and the difference was like looking at night and day. If she married at all, it would be a miracle. The memory ebbed from her consciousness as Mary contemplated her situation. Grace and Calvin moved to New Jersey, where he got a good-paying job. and the departure of her closest sibling left a hole in her heart. As much as she loved her other sisters and brothers, Grace's presence had been the one reason she lingered on in Maine as long as she did. She heard of men out west seeking wives, and had been tempted to go to one, but she couldn't bear to be apart from her sister. It seemed that fate dictated the separation anyway, leaving her free to pursue her own dreams for the first time in her life. Slipping the ad into her pocket, she hastened to the restaurant so she could start her work on time. As soon as Mary arrived home from work, she hung her hat on the hat rack in the entryway and noted that her parents occupied the parlor. Her father sat in his favorite blue chair, reading another book, while her mother worked on her knitting. She often knitted clothes for her 31 grandchildren. The house remained silent, as is often the case since her siblings left to marry and have families of their own. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the room, her shoes seeming to echo on the hardwood floors, though the pounding in her heart distracted her from the sound. They looked at her as she shifted from one foot to the other in front of them. "Mary, is something on your mind?" Her father closed his book and waited for her to speak. It was now or never. After handing him the ad, she braced herself so she could speak before she lost her nerve. "Today, I made an important decision. I'm going to answer one of those ads asking for a wife. I found one that is of particular interest from a farmer in Nebraska, and from the sound of it, I believe he and I will make a good match." Her father read the ad, handed it to her mother, and stared at Mary as if she had suddenly grown a second head. "You intend to marry a stranger?" She sat on the edge of the wooden chair, close to the open window. Since she broke into a sweat under their intense stares, she was grateful for the breeze drifting into the small room. Her mother loudly sighed and patted her graying hair that was neatly tied back into a bun. "Honey," she began, "are you sure this is a wise idea?" Her father nodded his approval at her mother's question, his frown deepened the wrinkles around his gray eyebrows. Mary licked her lips nervously. "I thought you might be relieved," she admitted. "As it is, none of the men here will marry me, and I know you worry about what will happen to me once you die." "Mary, this man could be older than your father," her mother said. "I plan to write him a letter asking him his age. If he responds, then I'll know if he's worth marrying. Besides, I would like to see the prairie. I heard it's beautiful." Her father made a shooing motion with his hand. "We have beautiful days in Maine. Every fall is witness to that fact when the leaves change into spectacular colors. I defy Nebraska to hold a candle to this state." "I'm 19, she said. "No man has come by to court me, nor do I perceive that one will if I stay here. I don't want to be a spinster. I want to get married and have children." "But what about love?" her mother asked. "Love is for beautiful women, Mother. I understand why men ignore me. The man posting this ad needs a wife. This is my best chance. I don't expect him to love me. I just want someone who can provide for me and my children." "Still, an arranged marriage to someone that you never met may not be the best avenue to pursue," her mother countered as she gave the ad back to her daughter. Taking a deep breath, Mary stood up, clutching the ad in her hand. "I'm sorry, but I'm old enough to make these decisions without your approval." The knot in her stomach tightened. "Let your mother and I discuss this, and we'll talk to you," her father said. Her father's dismissal angered her, but she kept silent as she strode out of the room. Her hands trembled as she climbed the narrow wooden staircase to her small bedroom that had once belonged to her and Grace. The room happened to be above the parlor, and since the window was open, she could hear her parents as they talked. She sat on her springy thin mattress and stared at the bare white wall so she could detect their voices over the chatter from people as they walked past the house. "What if the man who wrote this ad is unsavory?" her mother asked her father. "He could be a criminal or abusive." A long pause followed before her father spoke. "Or he could be a young man who wants a wife to help him with his farm." "But how can we know?" her mother asked. "We can't," he said, "but we do know Mary. She has always been a practical and smart girl. Though she has a heart of gold, men rarely look beyond appearances. You know how hard we've tried to find her someone, but but no one will talk to her long enough to get to know her. Surely they'll grow out of that, her mother insisted. As men mature, they learn the value of a good woman. Looks do fade. And how old do these men have to be when they realize this? Would you have her marry someone as old as I am? But Nebraska is so far from here, she protested. We'll probably never see her again. We'll be lucky if she even writes. Men out west who are in need of wives might be the answer to our prayers. We need to think of what's best for her. Once this man gets to know her, he will be glad that she went out to him. First we lose Grace, and now Mary. Mary could tell by the way her mother's voice choked that she was crying. Now, Abby, do you really want to see the poor girl spend her life alone because we were too selfish to let her go? Her mother's sobs increased. She may be 19, but she'll always be a baby to me. The youngest child is usually the hardest to let go, he said. His footsteps echoed on the floor as he approached his wife. He most likely knelt in front of her and rested his hand on her knee, as Mary had often seen him do when he wished to comfort her. She wants to have babies of her own. Her brothers and sisters have their families. Isn't it her turn? Seconds spanned to minutes that seemed to drag for what seemed like an hour before her mother finally relented. Mary experienced a mixture of feelings as she wrote her response to the ad. Anticipation, hope, curiosity. Surprisingly, doubt was not part of her swirling emotions. Deep down, she felt that this was the best course of action for her to pursue. She didn't know the best approach to answering a man she had never met, so she decided to stick with the basics. Dear Neil Craftsman, my name is Mary Peters, and I am a 19-year-old woman who has never married. Though I grew up in town, I am willing to adapt to farm living. I am competent in cooking and sewing, so I can make you good meals and clothes. I have helped the midwife deliver babies, so I can assist you with the birth of your animals. I am not afraid of hard work, and you will find me most dependable. I also come from a family of 6 brothers and 5 sisters, so I am confident your request for children will be fulfilled as well. May I ask your age? If you wish to respond, please write to P.O. Box 54. Sincerely, Mary Peters. The next day she left the house to send a letter. Her heart raced with a sudden wave of fear that he would tell her not to come. The walk to the post office seemed to be quicker than usual, and she stood in front of the small building, wondering if it might be better to not answer the ad. Rejection from men who saw her happened often. But what if he didn't like something in her personality? But how much could he learn from her in a short letter? And what if he asked her to marry him? Her family would miss her. She wouldn't share Christmas with them anymore. She glanced at the envelope in her shaking hands. A raindrop fell on the white paper. Wiping the wet spot off the envelope, she glanced at the cloudy sky. She should have brought an umbrella. Apparently she wasn't thinking straight if she neglected to note the threatening storm. Her mother had offered to go with her, but she wanted to do this by herself, in case she chickened out at the last minute. She could easily tell her parents that she sent the letter and never got a response. No one would be the wiser, and she could continue to live her life as she had up to that point. Wouldn't it be better to dream that he had said yes if she sent the letter, rather than find out that he didn't want her to come? Behind her, a child called out to her mother. She recognized Bertha Lindsay with her 2-year-old daughter. Bertha stopped in front of the bakery, a couple of buildings down from the post office. Looking up and seeing Mary, she waved. The daughter waved as well. Mary smiled and nodded and watched them as they entered the store. Taking a deep breath, she turned her attention back to the letter. If she didn't send this, she might never be like Bertha. Bertha had a husband, a child, and another child on the way. Mary didn't need to fool herself into thinking Neil Craftsman was going to take one look at her and fall in love with her, the way that men had fallen in love with her sisters and Bertha. But he might be happy to have her assistance on the farm, and perhaps, given time, he might even be content with her. She wouldn't know unless she tried. Decision made, she went inside the post office to send a letter. A month passed, and Mary fluctuated between running to the post office and dragging her feet. What if he accepted? What if he declined? Her stomach was a tangled mess, though she managed to hide this fact from her family and friends. Then, on a Tuesday, his response came. She didn't dare open the letter in public. Instead, she hurried home, raced up the stairs, and shut her bedroom door behind her so she could have her privacy. Standing in the middle of the room, she took a deep breath to settle her nerves. This was it. Her future hinged on the contents in a single envelope. No, that wasn't true. If he said no, she could answer another ad. If only men weren't so concerned with how a woman looked. She carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the paper. Some money and a train ticket fell to the floor. Startled, she bent down to pick the items up. As she did so, it occurred to her that his answer was yes. Her heart thumped loudly in her ears while she eagerly read the letter's contents. Mary, I am 30 and grow wheat. I also manage a sizable number of cattle. You sound like a woman who will suit me. Enclosed are the ticket for your trip to Nebraska and some money for anything you may need to buy for a living here. Neil Craftsman. Thrilled, she turned toward her bedroom door. The dollar bill stuck to her shoe, reminding her that she needed to put the ticket and money in a safe place. She shoved them under her mattress before she flew down the steps. Mary, what's gotten into you? Her mother called out from the kitchen. The woman looked startled as Mary entered the room, her face flushed. Why, I've never seen you so worked up over anything before. From the way you're smiling, I take that it's good news? It is. Mary thrust the letter in her direction. He said yes. I'll be leaving in a week. Her mother accepted the piece of paper and read it. Mary gathered the ingredients to help her mother with the pot roast that she had planned to make for dinner. He even sent me a train ticket and some money for anything I may need before I go out there. She set the armful of potatoes, celery, and carrots on the counter before she reached for the seasonings. I can't think of anything to buy. I already have everything I need. I'm not even sure what farm wives need. She washed the vegetables. I wonder what life will be like out there. I'll have to do some research so I know what to expect. Realizing that she was rambling, which she rarely did, she stopped so her mother could speak if she wished. Her smile faltered when she saw that her mother kept her eyes on the letter, her mouth in a firm line. Feeling awkward, she put on her apron. She adjusted her bun and wiped her hands on the apron when she noticed they were clammy. Afraid to speak, for she suddenly realized that she didn't want to know what her mother thought, she began cutting the vegetables. The early afternoon sunlight poured through the window, giving her adequate lighting for her task, but the heat coming from the oven caused sweat to cover her brow. The lack of a breeze blowing on the kitchen didn't help matters, nor the heat rising in her face from the knowledge that her mother was not pleased. So, you will leave next Thursday? Her mother's words sounded distant. Unsure of what to say, Mary spent the next 5 minutes adding slices of vegetables to the roast her mother settled into the deep baking dish. Mary licked her lips before asking, Is there anything you wish to advise me on? I do wish to be a good wife for him. The older woman sighed as she seasoned the meat. Mary, are you sure you want to do this? Yes, Mary said. Father's right. I do want to get married and have children. After what seemed like an eternity, her mother said, It's natural that you should feel that way. Nevertheless, since this arrangement is done without you having first met him, we should buy you a return ticket. She covered the pot roast and vegetables with a lid, then placed the dish into the oven. Taking a deep breath, she asked, May I see the ticket? I will buy a return ticket for you on the day you will arrive in Omaha. Then you won't have to spend the night there. Timidly fingering the string on her apron, Mary forced her eyes on the woman staring expectantly at her. You don't think this will work? The question barely came out as a whisper. We must be practical about this, Mary. The woman's words were firm, her posture resolute and imposing in the small room. Her joy deflated, Mary stiffly nodded and went to get the ticket. On the day she left, Mary's family was gathered to see her off. She hesitated in knowing how to say goodbye. Shifting from one foot to the other, she waited for the conductor to call for passengers to board the train. Well, this is it, her father said in a solemn tone. Be careful when you're on the train. Don't talk to men you don't know unless it's the conductor. As for Mr. Craftsman, trust your instinct. Your father is right, her mother quickly inserted. If he seemed like a bad man, you'd come right back. Not wishing to argue, she nodded her agreement. However, Mary had made up her mind, and she had decided that, should Neil take one look at her and find her unsuitable for him, she would remain in Omaha and find employment. Women could be teachers or governesses, and she did have experience cooking in a restaurant. Options were available should marriage fail to be her future. All aboard! The conductor's voice boomed through the small one-room station. It's time for me to go. She forced a smile, quickly blinking back her tears. Her family didn't like it when she cried. You will write, won't you? Her mother asked. Yes, I promise. Mary clenched her hands together, suddenly aware that she was nervous. Clearing his throat, her father held his hand out to her. Surprised, since he didn't make it a habit of touching her, she shook it. Her mother also shook her hand. Take care of yourself. I will, Mary said, and thank you both for everything. Her voice shook, so she refrained from saying anything else. All aboard! We depart in 2 minutes, the conductor called out. Have a good trip, her brother said. The others voiced their well wishes before she got on the train. Showing the conductor her ticket, she wiped her tears on the crisp handkerchief. She found her seat, noting the one next to hers was empty. A new life. She could do this. Looking out the window, she gave one last smile to her parents who had followed her to the platform. The train pulled out of the station, and despite the sorrow of leaving her family, her heart leapt with a sense of adventure. And that is the end of chapter 1.